Karen slaps blind man's guide dog for sniffing her leg. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The midday sun filtered through the glass windows of the upscale shopping center, casting a warm glow on the marble floors and polished storefronts. The air was filled with the gentle hum of high-end shoppers, their voices a soft murmur as they strolled past designer boutiques and luxury watch displays. The shopping center was a sanctuary for those with refined tastes and deep pockets, a place where elegance met exclusivity. The clink of cashmere scarves and the shuffle of polished leather shoes were as much a part of the atmosphere as the faint scent of perfume lingering in the air. The high ceilings, adorned with modern chandeliers, created an airy expanse that seemed to make everything feel just a little more elevated, a little more pristine. Among the people walking down the polished hallways, a blind man, dressed in a crisp shirt and tailored trousers, made his way through the crowd with a sense of purpose. He wore dark sunglasses, his cane tapping rhythmically in front of him as he moved. By his side, a service dog, an impeccably trained Labrador retriever, walked patiently, its harness marked with the bright red patch indicating that it was a guide dog. The man's hand rested lightly on the dog's harness, guiding it as the animal effortlessly maneuvered through the crowd, weaving around people without hesitation. The dog, with its alert eyes and calm demeanor, was doing its job flawlessly, aiding its handler in navigating the busy, unfamiliar environment. It was a routine the man had grown accustomed to over the years: shopping trips, errands, and the daily movements through public spaces, all made possible by the help of his loyal companion. However, as they approached the high-end coffee bar in the corner of the shopping center, the blind man and his dog drew the attention of a few passers-by, some nodding approvingly at the sight of the well-behaved animal, others curious but respectful. But not everyone in the shopping center was as understanding. Karen, a woman in her mid-40s, was one of those who couldn't seem to understand the quiet respect the dog had earned in public spaces. She had been browsing a nearby clothing store, enjoying the luxurious fabrics and the warmth of the midday sun streaming through the glass, when her attention was suddenly drawn to the sight of the blind man and his guide dog moving past her. She had been having a relatively calm day, strolling through the shopping center to pick up a few items before returning home, but the appearance of the dog, and the proximity it had to her, seemed to break the tranquility of her afternoon. Karen had never been particularly fond of animals in public spaces, and the sight of a dog walking so close to her sent a sharp wave of discomfort through her. The dog was too close, it was sniffing around, and Karen could already feel herself growing tense at the thought of it invading her personal space. It wasn't the dog's fault, she told herself. It was just doing its job. But that didn't stop the irritation from mounting as the animal passed too close for comfort. In her mind, the dog was too large, too bold in its movements, its sniffing seeming too intrusive. She hated how close it was to her, the way it seemed to be taking liberties with her space. As the blind man and his dog continued on their way, Karen stepped aside, hoping the dog would simply move on. But instead, the dog, likely just doing its job of sniffing its surroundings, moved a little closer to Karen, its nose brushing gently against her leg. For the briefest moment, she froze, her discomfort surging into annoyance as the dog continued its harmless investigation. The sniff was barely noticeable, nothing more than a brief touch, but to Karen, it felt like an invasion. She had never been comfortable around animals, and the thought of a dog sniffing her leg was enough to send her into a state of agitation. Her mind raced, her frustration bubbling to the surface in a way that seemed disproportionate, but she couldn't stop it. The anxiety, the irritation, the discomfort, it all combined in that single moment, making her feel cornered and out of control. And in that moment of mounting discomfort, she made a decision that would quickly escalate the situation into something far worse. Without thinking, Karen reached out, her hand slapping down firmly onto the dog's snout, a loud smack echoing through the bustling shopping center. The dog, startled, pulled back, its tail briefly stiffening as it reacted to the sudden contact. The man, his focus solely on the path ahead, didn't immediately notice, but Karen's voice rang out clear and sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of the shopping center. "Animals have no business being indoors," she yelled, her voice laced with a fury that seemed out of place for the situation. She was angry now, her pulse quickening as she looked down at the dog, who was still trying to regain its composure. The dog had done nothing wrong, had simply been sniffing in its natural behavior, yet Karen's mind was clouded with a sense of entitlement and frustration. The dog had crossed a line, her line, and she wasn't going to let it go without expressing her outrage. The sound of the slap, followed by Karen's loud outburst, immediately caught the attention of several people around her. The coffee barista looked up, his face pale with confusion, while a few nearby shoppers turned to witness the commotion. The blind man, still unaware of the situation unfolding, turned his head slightly, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. He felt the tension in the air, the sudden coldness that seemed to wrap around him, but he couldn't yet comprehend why. Karen stood there, seething with anger, as the dog recoiled and the blind man finally realized what had happened. His face hardened with confusion, and the man's grip on his cane tightened as he turned his head toward Karen, trying to process what had just occurred. His voice, though calm, carried an undercurrent of disbelief. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice firm but not aggressive, "but you can't treat my service dog like that." Karen, caught in the moment and blinded by her own anger, didn't immediately respond. Her heart raced as the blind man spoke to her, his words cutting through the fog of her frustration. She felt the weight of the situation crashing down on her, the discomfort of her actions becoming more apparent with each passing second. The onlookers had fallen silent, the few people who had been watching now looking around awkwardly, unsure of how to handle the situation. I didn't mean to," Karen stammered, her confidence faltering as she tried to backpedal, but the damage had already been done. The dog, now visibly uncomfortable, stood beside its handler, who reached down to pat the dog's head, trying to calm it. The man's expression had shifted from confusion to a quiet, dignified disappointment. He had experienced far worse in his life, disrespect, prejudice, and condescension, but this was something different. It was an unwarranted attack on something he had come to rely on every day of his life. The dog was not just an animal to him, it was a vital part of his independence, his freedom to navigate the world. And yet, in this upscale shopping center, Karen had chosen to lash out at something she didn't understand. "I'm so sorry," Karen said, her voice faltering as the weight of her actions hit her. She hadn't intended to strike the dog, she hadn't meant to cause harm, but her impulsive response had led her down a path she couldn't undo. She could see now that her anger had been misdirected, that she had chosen to lash out at something so innocent and kind. The man, his face still calm but now filled with a quiet strength, nodded slowly as he adjusted his grip on his cane, as though the apology was already understood, but still unsatisfying. "Just remember," he said, his voice steady, "this dog is my partner. She's here to help me, to make sure I can navigate this world safely. It's not just a dog. It's my guide." Karen's heart dropped as she listened to him, realizing with a painful clarity that her actions had been far more harmful than she had initially perceived. She had allowed her discomfort and her own biases to blind her to the reality of the situation, and in doing so, she had humiliated someone who had simply been going about their day. "I'm truly sorry," Karen repeated, her voice thick with remorse, but the blind man had already turned his attention back to his dog, his composure unshaken despite the tension of the moment. Karen stood there for a moment longer, watching him as he began to lead the dog toward the exit, her mind swimming with the realization of just how wrong she had been. She had acted out of frustration, and in doing so, had wounded not just a service animal but the person who relied on it every single day. As she watched them leave the coffee shop, Karen couldn't shake the feeling of regret that now filled every inch of her being. The lesson had been hard learned, and there was no way to undo the hurt she had caused. All she could do now was sit with the discomfort of knowing that she had let her anger control her actions and, in the process, lost a little bit of the person she had thought she was. The moment Karen's hand made contact with the guide dog's snout, the atmosphere in the shopping center seemed to change in an instant. The crisp midday air, once filled with the soft murmur of shoppers and the clink of high-end shopping bags, was now heavy with tension. The slap was louder than Karen had expected, sharp and cutting through the hum of the busy space like a slap to the face. Her pulse quickened, the adrenaline surging as she watched the dog recoil from the sudden contact, its ears flattening in response to the unexpected aggression. The man, still unaware of the escalating situation, continued walking forward, his grip on his cane firm, the steady tap of it against the ground the only indication that he was moving with purpose. But as the dog flinched, the blind man's head turned, and for the first time, his attention shifted toward Karen. His face, though calm, was now filled with a subtle confusion. He had felt the dog pull back, felt the slight tension in the air, and now he could hear Karen's voice ringing in the open space. "Animals have no business being indoors," she had yelled, the words harsh and filled with a sense of entitlement that Karen was too blind to see through. The words, now echoing in the otherwise quiet shopping center, seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog, clouding the interactions around her. People in the vicinity turned their heads, some in confusion, others in discomfort, unsure of how to react to the tension that had suddenly erupted between the woman and the service animal. The barista behind the counter, who had been preparing lattes moments before, had stopped what he was doing and was watching the scene unfold with a furrowed brow. The elderly man, having sensed the shift in the air, slowly lowered his cane and took a deep breath, his calm demeanor now a stark contrast to the seething woman standing before him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but steady, filled with the quiet authority that comes from years of navigating a world that often isn't built for people like him. Karen stood there, her hands still frozen in midair as she realized the full weight of what she had just done. She had slapped a service dog, a dog that was not just an animal, but a life-saving companion to someone who needed it. The guilt began to creep in, but she tried to suppress it, to hold on to the anger and frustration that had led her to lash out in the first place. "Did you just slap my dog?" the man asked again, this time his tone firmer, the quiet pain of disbelief underlying the words. His expression had shifted from confusion to something more intense, something that Karen could not ignore. She had never been confronted like this, never had someone question her actions so directly. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had crossed the line, and the man, who had been nothing but respectful, was now forced to defend the animal that had been wrongfully treated. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out at first. She had been so caught up in her own frustration, and the sense of violation she felt when the dog had come too close, that she hadn't even considered the possibility that her reaction had been not just overblown, but deeply inappropriate. Her mind raced, trying to justify her actions, but each passing second made it harder to find any justification that would make sense. The man wasn't a threat, the dog wasn't dangerous. She had allowed her own discomfort with animals in public spaces to cloud her judgment, to turn a minor inconvenience into a confrontation. The truth was simple, she had lashed out at something that, in hindsight, didn't even deserve her anger. I didn't mean to," Karen stammered, her voice faltering as she tried to find the right words. She felt the eyes of the other shoppers on her now, the weight of their gaze pressing in from all sides. She had made a scene, and not just any scene, a scene where she had assaulted a guide dog, a service animal, and publicly humiliated its owner. She could see the shock on the man's face, but it wasn't the anger she expected. It was a quiet, almost resigned disappointment, as though he had long since come to terms with the fact that people would treat him and his dog with disrespect and ignorance. He wasn't yelling at her, wasn't causing a scene in return. Instead, he simply stood there, looking at her with an expression that spoke more volumes than any words ever could. "I didn't mean to. I thought it was attacking me," Karen said, her words rushing out in a desperate attempt to explain herself, but the more she tried, the less convincing they became. She realized that even as she tried to rationalize her behavior, the realization of how wrong she had been became clearer with each passing second. She had allowed a harmless sniff to trigger a knee-jerk response, and now, in the quiet aftermath, she was struggling to undo what she had done. But the more she looked at the man's face, the quiet resilience in his eyes, the more she understood that there was nothing she could say to make this right. There was no quick apology that would erase the damage she had caused. "I'm really sorry," she said, her voice softer now, the weight of her apology not just a formality but a true reflection of her regret. She didn't know if the words would be enough to atone for her actions, but she knew she had to try. The elderly man nodded, his face still calm, but Karen could see the subtle shift in his expression. He had heard the apology, but it was clear that the damage was not just to him but to his service dog, too. The dog, who had once been so calm and confident, was now standing by its handler, its body language slightly tense, unsure of how to react to the woman who had attacked it. The barista, sensing the awkwardness in the air, walked over hesitantly, his eyes moving from Karen to the blind man and back. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone tentative, as though unsure whether to intervene. The elderly man, his expression unchanged, nodded toward the barista. "It's fine," he said simply, though his voice carried a quiet weight. "Just, please remember that service animals aren't pets. They're working. They're doing a job. And they're here to help people like me." Karen swallowed hard, her throat thick with emotion, as she heard the quiet strength in the man's words. She had taken it for granted that the world was hers to control, that she could decide who and what belonged in spaces she frequented. She had assumed her discomfort was enough to justify her reaction. But now, as the man stood there, his guide dog by his side, she realized just how wrong she had been. Her actions had come from a place of ignorance, of entitlement, and it had caused harm to someone who had done nothing but try to go about his day. "I'll make sure to remember," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible as she finally backed away, stepping aside to let the man and his dog pass. The blind man gave her a small nod, his face still serene, as he led his dog forward. Karen watched them for a moment, the weight of the apology still heavy on her chest, but now, for the first time, she understood the true cost of her actions. She had slapped a service animal, had disrespected a man who only wanted to live his life with the help of his guide dog. She could feel the eyes of others on her as she turned away, but this time, she didn't care. She knew that the real punishment would not come from any judgment or shame others would place on her, but from the deep regret that would stay with her, reminding her of how easily she had let her frustration dictate her actions. The shopping center was still bustling, the midday rush continuing as more and more shoppers filled the space, their footsteps clicking against the marble floors, their voices blending into a low murmur that seemed to fill every corner of the expansive space. But for Karen, everything felt distant, muted, as though she had stepped into a world where the noise no longer mattered. She stood frozen for a moment, her heart racing in her chest, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what had just occurred. The words she had shouted at the guide dog, the slap she had delivered so impulsively, all of it hung in the air like a weight that she couldn't shake off, a burden she had placed on herself and on the man she had wronged. As the elderly man and his guide dog walked away, Karen's eyes followed them, her gaze heavy with regret. The blind man hadn't raised his voice at her, hadn't retaliated in any way. He had simply accepted her apology and moved on, his calmness and grace contrasting sharply with her own frustration and anger. There was no malice in his eyes, no bitterness, only the quiet understanding of someone who had likely encountered such ignorance many times before. His dog, his loyal companion, remained by his side, walking with the steady confidence that only a service animal could have. Karen felt a pang of guilt stab through her heart as she realized that she had taken something from him that was irreplaceable, not just his space in the shopping center, but his peace, his ability to move through the world without having to worry about people treating him like an inconvenience. And all because of a momentary frustration over something so trivial. She had been upset, yes, but she realized now that her reaction had been driven by something deeper than the simple discomfort of an animal in her personal space. Her frustration had been rooted in something she couldn't quite articulate, a sense of entitlement, a belief that she had the right to dictate the terms of the space around her. She had seen the dog sniff as an intrusion, a violation of her personal bubble, and in that moment, she had allowed her discomfort to overtake her sense of empathy, of understanding. The blind man, with his calm composure and his unwavering trust in his guide dog, had reminded her of something she had forgotten in the heat of the moment, that animals, especially service animals, had a role far beyond what she could comprehend in her limited view. They were not just pets, they were partners, lifelines for people who depended on them to navigate a world that often made no allowances for their challenges. As Karen made her way to a nearby bench, her legs felt heavy beneath her, as though each step was laden with the weight of her actions. She found a spot away from the main walkway and sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she rested them on her knees. She had tried to justify what she had done, tried to convince herself that her anger had been a reasonable response to an inconvenience, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized just how wrong she had been. She had never once stopped to consider the perspective of the blind man or the dog. She had been so focused on her own discomfort that she had failed to see the bigger picture, the picture that involved a person who needed his guide dog to safely navigate the world, to have the independence and freedom that she took for granted every day. And now, as the realization of her actions began to sink in, Karen felt a deep sense of shame rise up within her, suffocating her. The truth of what she had done hit her harder than she had expected. She had struck the dog, a creature who had done nothing but try to help its handler, and she had done so with an aggression that was unjustified. She had let her frustration turn into something far darker, something that had hurt not just the dog but the man who had trusted his companion with his safety, with his ability to move through a world that wasn't built for him. The shame she felt now was not just because of her physical actions, but because of the realization that she had acted out of ignorance, out of an unwillingness to see beyond her own discomfort. And that was what hurt the most, the fact that she had not only treated the man and his dog with disrespect, but she had done so without any real understanding of their lives, their struggles, their need for dignity and independence. Karen closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts, but it was difficult to find any clarity amidst the swirling tide of guilt that engulfed her. She had never considered how her actions might affect others beyond the surface level. She had always assumed that her rights, her comfort, came first. And in that moment, her selfishness had led her to lash out at something that was far more important than her personal space, a man's life and his reliance on the very creature she had hurt. She had crossed the line, and she couldn't undo what had been done. The only thing she could do now was reflect, to sit with the discomfort of her actions and hope that, in time, she could learn from this mistake. A few minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before Karen's mind finally began to clear a little. She had expected the shame to be unbearable, but in a way, it was the clarity that hurt the most. The guilt was sharp, but the realization of her ignorance was what truly stung. She had treated someone like they were less than, as if their presence in her space was something that could be disregarded without consequence. The blind man had been nothing but composed, nothing but patient, and she had repaid him with hostility. She couldn't ignore that anymore, and the heaviness of it weighed on her more than the brief burst of anger ever had. The shopping center continued around her, the noise of people moving in and out of stores, the sound of shoes on marble floors, and the faint laughter of children playing in a nearby atrium. Yet Karen felt disconnected from it all. The weight of her actions had created a barrier between her and the world around her, a wall that separated her from the people who were just going about their day. She could feel their eyes, even though no one was looking at her directly. She could feel the judgment, even if it wasn't overt. The shame lingered, and she wasn't sure how long it would take for it to dissipate, if it ever would. But as Karen sat there, trying to process the magnitude of what she had done, she realized something important. She had made a mistake, a big one, but it didn't define her entirely. Yes, her actions had been cruel, impulsive, and misguided, but the fact that she was acknowledging them, that she was sitting with the discomfort of her own guilt, meant that she was capable of change. It wasn't too late for her to do better, to learn, to grow from this experience. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but Karen knew that this moment, the moment she realized how far she had gone wrong, was the first step toward making things right. As she stood up from the bench, the crowd still moving around her, she took a deep breath. She hadn't fixed anything yet, but she could start by being better. She could start by being more aware, by listening, by respecting others, and by understanding the world beyond her own narrow viewpoint. The man and his dog were no longer in sight, but the lesson they had unknowingly taught her was one she wouldn't forget. It was a small, quiet moment, but it had shaken Karen to her core. The world wasn't about claiming spaces or making others yield to your discomfort. It was about learning to coexist, to share, and to understand. And she had a long way to go. But for the first time in a while, Karen was ready to make the effort. Karen stood in the shopping center for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing, thoughts tumbling over one another in a chaotic mess of guilt and regret. She had made a mistake, one that, in her own mind, had escalated too quickly, too violently, and it was becoming clearer by the second that there was no way to undo what had just happened. The elderly man and his guide dog were gone, leaving nothing but the aftermath of the confrontation hanging in the air. The soft murmur of voices, the click of shoes on the polished floors, and the occasional chime of the cash register seemed so distant, as if they were all happening in another world. The shopping center, which had once felt so familiar, now seemed cold and sterile, its grandeur and elegance meaningless in comparison to the emotional weight she carried. Karen's chest tightened with the realization that, no matter how much time passed, she couldn't erase the sting of what she had done. She had reacted without thinking, without considering the consequences of her actions, and now, standing in the midst of this pristine, polished environment, she was confronted by the reality that her outburst had left an indelible mark on the man, his guide dog, and herself. The more she reflected on the incident, the clearer it became that her frustration had been entirely misplaced. The dog hadn't been a threat, it had only been doing its job, helping its handler navigate a world that was not built for people like him. But Karen had let her discomfort, her impatience, cloud her judgment, and in doing so, she had lashed out at an innocent animal and its handler. Her hand instinctively reached up to her face, rubbing at the spot where she had slapped the table in frustration earlier, and the motion only served to bring the memory of her actions into sharper focus. She could still hear the harsh sound of her palm striking the table, the way the dog had recoiled in surprise, the way the man had paused, sensing the tension before he even turned his head to face her. That moment, the moment she had crossed the line, was replaying over and over in her mind, and no matter how much she wished she could go back and do things differently, she knew it was too late. There was no undoing the damage. She had acted on impulse, and now she had to live with the consequences. Karen felt a deep sense of shame settle in her stomach, a weight that grew heavier with each passing second. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone, certainly not the dog or the elderly man, but her actions had shown a complete lack of respect for both. She had allowed her anger to control her, to make her feel entitled to something that wasn't hers to claim. In that moment, her sense of ownership over the space, the table in the coffee shop, the sense of comfort she had felt in this familiar place, had consumed her, and she had turned that misplaced frustration into an attack. And now, standing in the middle of the shopping center, she could no longer ignore the fact that she had treated the man and his service dog as though they didn't matter, as though their presence didn't deserve the same respect she demanded for herself. The blind man had been calm, composed, and patient, accepting her apology without confrontation, but there had been something in his eyes, the brief flicker of hurt, perhaps, or disappointment, that had stayed with her. His silence spoke volumes. He hadn't shouted, hadn't retaliated, but Karen could see in his quiet demeanor that he had been affected by her words and her actions. He hadn't let the moment break him, but she couldn't help but wonder what he thought of her now. What had gone through his mind when she had raised her voice at his dog, slapped the table in anger, and made him feel like an inconvenience in a place where he should have felt safe and respected? The more Karen thought about it, the more she realized that her frustration had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding, not just of the situation, but of the people around her. She had assumed that the dog was an intrusion, something that didn't belong in her space, but she hadn't considered that the dog's presence was a lifeline, a vital companion to someone who needed it to navigate the world. In her eyes, the dog had been an obstacle, a disruption to her comfort, but in reality, the dog had been there to help someone lead a life of independence. And she had tried to tear that down. Karen's hands, which had been trembling slightly, now felt cold. She lowered them to her sides, and her gaze shifted to the entrance of the coffee shop. For a moment, she considered leaving, just walking out of the shopping center and putting the entire experience behind her, but she knew she couldn't do that. The weight of what had happened would follow her, no matter where she went. She needed to face it, to confront the reality of her actions. Taking a deep breath, Karen turned and walked toward the exit, her mind still swirling with regret. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, what she could do to make up for what had happened, but she knew she couldn't just pretend like it hadn't occurred. She couldn't walk away from it and bury it in the back of her mind. She needed to do something, to try to make things right. But what? What could she possibly do to fix this? As she reached the entrance to the shopping center, she paused, her hand resting on the door handle as she scanned the area in front of her. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but her eyes eventually found the elderly man again, sitting by the fountain in the courtyard outside. He was sipping from a takeout cup of coffee, his guide dog lying patiently by his side, its head resting on its paws. The man's face was serene, his expression calm, but Karen could see the subtle stiffness in his posture, the way he held himself just a little more rigid than before. She knew that she had played a part in that discomfort, in that tension. And in that moment, Karen realized that the only way to begin to make things right was to go to him, to apologize properly, and to show him that she had learned from her mistake. She took a tentative step forward, the weight in her chest still heavy but now accompanied by a small flicker of resolve. As she walked toward him, she rehearsed the words she wanted to say in her head, though she wasn't sure if they would be enough. She wasn't sure if any words could undo the hurt she had caused, but she knew that she had to try. The man looked up as she approached, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no anger, no condemnation in his gaze, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Karen's throat tighten. It was quiet disappointment, a recognition that he had been wronged but that there was no point in holding onto the past. "Excuse me," Karen said softly, her voice faltering slightly. I wanted to apologize. For what I did. To your dog, and to you. I was wrong. I acted out of frustration, and I didn't stop to think about how my actions would affect you. I'm really sorry." The man steadied her for a moment, his face unreadable, and for a second, Karen felt the knot of guilt tighten even further. She was sure he wouldn't accept her apology, that he would turn away and walk off, leaving her to wallow in her regret. But then, unexpectedly, he nodded, his expression softening slightly. "It's all right," he said, his voice calm and steady. "People act out of anger or fear sometimes. I understand. Just, next time, maybe take a moment to think. Animals like my dog, they help people like me. They're not here to cause trouble. I know you didn't mean it, but," he paused, giving her a look that she couldn't quite read, "you could be kinder next time." Karen swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. She hadn't expected forgiveness, hadn't expected anything except maybe to be dismissed. But the man's quiet understanding, his ability to see the situation with grace, made her realize just how much she had to learn. She nodded silently, feeling the enormity of her apology not just in the words she had said, but in the quiet humility that came with acknowledging how wrong she had been. As she turned to walk away, she felt a little lighter. It wasn't a solution, not yet, but it was a step. She had apologized. She had faced the consequences of her actions. And for the first time in a long while, Karen felt the quiet promise of change.